Greetings and welcome to a first impressions video here at My Xbox and Me. Today we're going to talk about the 1.0 release of Playerunknown's Battlegrounds on Xbox One. It's hard to know what to say about Playerunknown's Battlegrounds that hasn't already been said since its release on Xbox One last December. In truth, the game hasn't really changed all that much since the patch that marked its official release. You jump out of a plane with up to 100 other people, scavenge the map for loot, and try to survive as the last person standing. Only now there's a new map and a boatload of new microtransactions. And with the game continuing to evolve, it seems almost arbitrary that PUBG Corp have decided to call the game finished. It certainly runs better than it has in the recent past, but still nowhere near perfect. While the frame rate is more stable and the load times and texturing are generally better than they were, PUBG is still littered with technical issues. Jumping out of the plane early to try and get the jump on your opponents is a waste of time. The game still has major issues with loading the map and assets, and if you hit the ground too early, all you'll be greeted with is half-melted, Lovecraftian-esque shapes in the form of buildings and no loot to pick up. And that's if the ground itself is even loaded in at all. I spent a few plane rides since launch watching the land below me load in square by square. Sometimes you might not get that far, instead being thrust into a match while still stuck looking at the loading screen. This is PUBG's biggest technical problem, but it's far from the game's only technical problem. Dynamic texturing often fails to work, leaving you staring at untextured environmental objects and buildings as the game struggles to catch up. Directional audio, which is excellent when it works by the way, is maddeningly inconsistent, with an echoing problem that will have you paranoid over the sound of your own footsteps as much as other players. And then there's the desync, which allows you to take damage from bullets after you've already ducked behind cover. Oh, and of course, vehicles still handle like you're driving through the middle of the ice capades and will seemingly collide with thin air. The most frustrating part about all of these issues is that Playerunknown's Battlegrounds is a great game. In those rare fleeting moments when you somehow manage to avoid a lot of these issues and the gameplay loop is allowed to shine through, it's a fun time. Every half dozen matches or so, I remember why I've sunk over 100 hours into this game. There's something addictive about the gameplay loop of your average PUBG match. It's a game where you're largely doing nothing more than gathering loot, running, or hanging out waiting for other players to turn up. For the most part, you'll only actively be engaged in combat a very small proportion of the time, depending on where you choose to drop or how late in the game it is. The entire time, of course, there are 100 things going through your mind. Trying to balance your gear, keeping an eye out for enemies, plotting a route across the map, and generally obsessing about the slightest movement or silhouette. Finding other players as you make it deeper into a match is a tense experience filled with a ton of small but crucial decisions, any of which can result in victory or cruel death. There are RNG elements at play that can cruelly work against you, usually in the form of bad loot, but rather than be a major source of frustration, this is just an obstacle to overcome. Even playing on the same small handful of maps over and over again, no two matches are ever the same. Adapting to whatever circumstances you find yourself in is what makes PUBG so compelling when you're not fighting against performance issues. The 3 maps currently available all offer 3 subtly different types of Battle Royale experience. Miramar, the desert map, is large with huge sightlines and lots of breathing room. Sanhok, the newest map, is smaller and more geared towards getting players into close combat quickly. Erangel, the original map, sits between the two. Each map suits a different kind of playstyle, so preferences will depend on how quickly paced you prefer your Battle Royale experience, and whether you prefer long range or close quarters combat. There are still some gripes to be had with how PUBG is set up. Vehicles are an absolute nightmare to control, constantly skidding all over the place and crashing spectacularly into apparent thin air. The transition to Xbox from PC hasn't been entirely a smooth one either. While the controls have translated to a controller well for the most part, reloading can be fiddly and doesn't work if you try to do it too quickly after performing another action, such as aiming down the sights, causing sometimes big disruptions to how well the game flows. Looting is similarly awkward, especially changing attachments on guns, though in PUBG's defense, it's probably the best they could possibly reimagine it for the console space. In the end, Playerunknown's Battlegrounds is a game that I want to like a lot more than I do. The full Xbox release has been nothing more than a new map, a new suite of obnoxious microtransactions, and a couple of fixes for some of the issues that have plagued it during game preview. This is not a finished game, however, and there are plenty of technical issues that still persist. Every now and again, the stars align and you'll play a match or two that shows how much potential this game has, but more often, you'll simply be hamstrung by a game that still has a long way to go to live up to that potential.